Hey, you're getting ready for week 2 of We Walk Together. I want to give you some tips to help you be ready for this week's Bible study. First of all, 3 ways to give your group ownership. So, 3 ways to give your group ownership. 1, don't prepare a lecture. Don't prepare a lecture, listen. See, there are just very few people that can preach and have a group wanting to come back every week and hear it. So, the good news is, you don't have to preach. Your group members don't expect you to preach. They want a collaborative learning environment, and that's what you can create. So if you prepare a lecture for your first week or 2 of Bible study, they're going to get the idea, okay, my job is to come here and listen, not to come here and participate. So we don't want people to have that idea. Don't prepare a lecture. That may mean week 1 or 2, you finish early because people are used to listening to a teacher rather than collaborating on the learning. So that's okay. If you finish early, say, yeah, that's it, we're done. The next week, people will come ready to talk. So, the second way to give your group ownership is this. Assign research to group members in advance. You know, there's some good, helpful research that can be done before a study, but you don't have to do all of that. If you assign it to your members, for example, you could assign a word study to somebody. We talked about that last week. Say, hey, next week, these 2 words are important. Look up for us the definition of these words and how they're used. And then you can give them tools to do that if they need those tools. So another way to assign homework to people or assign research to people is tell someone, hey, look up for us what Jesus said about this topic we're going to study next week. Another way to do that is if you're studying a passage that is a narrative, then you could tell somebody, study this passage this week, and then next week at the beginning, tell us the story of this passage without looking at your notes or at your Bible. Great way to give people ownership. Or for letters, like Ephesians is one of Paul's letters, or for teaching passages, you could tell someone, will you bring us next week an outline of this passage? You know, just ways to give people some ownership in the process. So the question that I think about is, do I want my group members to become really good at listening to me teach, or do I want them to become really good at studying the Bible? Studying the Bible wins every time. So I want to see myself as a point guard, giving bounce passes to people, saying, hey, here's a little bit you can do to make our discussion better. Here's a little research that you can do to make sure that we understand this passage better. See yourself as the point guard, making bounce passes, creating a collaborative learning environment. So, another way to give your group ownership is this: keep the conversation moving. This is important because sometimes you'll have a person that talks too much, or you might have a person that advocates an incorrect understanding of the Bible. So when that happens, you need to be ready as the group leader. You need to be ready to do a few things. Here's one way that you can deal with a person who is talking too much or advocating the incorrect view of the Bible. If you know ahead of time who it's going to be, you sit right next to that person. When you sit right next to somebody, they don't get any eye contact from you. And if they don't get eye contact from you, they never feel that empowered to teach. The person that's sitting right across from you, that's the person that's going to get the most eye contact from you, and they're going to be more likely to talk the most. So sit across from somebody you want to talk, sit next to somebody that you don't want to talk. Another way, say, anyone else have an opinion on that? So if somebody in your group says something that you know is just theologically off the wall or questionable, you don't have to be the enforcer making sure that everybody's theology is correct. Let your group correct each other, and it creates a collaborative environment. So you say, anybody else have an opinion on that? Someone in your group that knows the Bible well is probably going to chime in and say, actually, I think in light of this passage, we might think about this another way. Great way to give your group ownership. Here's another way to deal with somebody who needs to not talk as much or is talking about something that isn't relevant. You could just table the discussion until later. Maybe it's something that should be talked about. It's just not relevant to the lesson that we're talking about now. You could say, hey, maybe we could have coffee this week and discuss that. Or this might be a topic we need to save for another week. You can just table the discussion. People appreciate that because it keeps the group from getting off track and the discussion from taking longer than it should. And fourth, this is the simplest way and the best way. When you realize somebody's just talking too much, or they're talking about something that the group doesn't care about, all you got to say is, next question. You ask that next question, and then all of a sudden, everybody else in the room has a chance to jump in and take the discussion back from the person who has been dominating it. So, a few tips that just help you as a leader give your group more ownership. Let's see. Hey, I wanted to point out a few theological notes, a few biblical notes on the passage that you're studying this week. It's Ephesians 4, starting in verse 7. We're going to look at some verses on spiritual gifts. You might remember from last week's video, I encouraged you to assign the word grace in Ephesians 4:7 as a word study for somebody in your group to do. Ephesians 4:7 says, "But to each of us grace has been given as Christ apportioned it." You know, in Romans 12:6, Paul says, "We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us." That word gift and grace, it's related. Gift would be charismatos, grace would be charis. So they both have the same root in Greek. So whenever you see in Ephesians 4:7, "But to each one of us grace has been given," you know, okay, the word is charis and it's related to charismatos. So somebody might say, you know, I don't see the word gifts coming up really in this passage. Well, that word grace, it's alluding to the idea of spiritual gifts. And then, of course, in verse 11, Paul lists some of the spiritual gifts. So if your group wants to know what is a spiritual gift, well, you could give this definition. A spiritual gift is a special ability that the Holy Spirit gives every believer. So every believer might have a different gift than other people, but every believer has a spiritual gift, at least one. So one of the questions deals with how to discover your gifts. Here are just the four things that come to mind when I think about that question. The most important one to me is begin serving in ministry. You can't really discover how God has gifted you until you're actually serving in ministry. So that's number one to me. But there are other things to keep in mind too. One, remember times when God used you. You can remember times God used you and think, oh, you know, he used me in that administrative role. Maybe I have the gift of administration. He used me in that teaching role. Maybe I have the gift of teaching. He used me in giving or in showing mercy. Maybe those are my gifts. A third way is ask other Christians. You can ask your family members who are Christian, friends who know you well who are Christian, what do you think my spiritual gift is? They may not be accurate in their observation, but whatever they say will be helpful for you as you try to discover your gifts. And then, of course, there's a spiritual gifts inventory. If you've been in church for several years, you probably at some point have taken a spiritual gifts inventory. It's almost like a personality test, but it's designed to help you discover what might be your spiritual gifts. They have some value. It's helpful to do. It might help you discover your gifts better. If you want to search the internet for one, you can get one by searching Lifeway Spiritual Gifts Survey. You can find a good spiritual gifts inventory that way. So, there are a few lists of spiritual gifts in the Bible. One of them is in our passage this week. Ephesians 4:11 lists some gifts. But here are three other passages that give lists of spiritual gifts. You've got Romans 12:6-8, 1 Corinthians 12:8-10, 1 Peter 4:9-11. So that may be helpful for you in preparing. One thing that might come up during your group time, since you're talking about spiritual gifts, there may be somebody in your group that wants to talk about what you could call the miracle gifts. The miracle gifts would be the gift of miracles, the gift of languages or tongues, the gift of prophecy, the gift of healing. Now, you could probably get through your whole Bible study and not discuss this and everybody would be just fine, but somebody may want to bring it up. So if you want to prepare a little for that ahead of time, then just email me. I can get you some resources that kind of give a brief introduction to why those gifts are kind of controversial. You know, some churches are very much into the miracle gifts, and some churches just stay away and don't mess with the miracle gifts. And there are reasons behind both of those positions and everything. You'll probably have people within your group that would have varying opinions on the spiritual gifts, on the miracle gifts. So if that comes up, you can just say, you know, I know some people think that possibly the miracle gifts aren't active today. They were meant to be active only during the time of the apostles. Say, that's really more than I know, but I can find some resources that might help you on that, or I could refer you to somebody that might help you. It's not something that you have to address just because somebody brings it up. You can refer to, you know, one of your ministers or something like that. But like I said, I'll be happy to email you a few pages of notes that I have on spiritual gifts, specifically on the miracle gifts, if you want to get into that. Let's see. One last thing, here's some optional homework that you could give to one or more group members. I would encourage you to pick 1, 2, maybe even 3 people in your group and say, hey, next week I want you to tell us this. How has Jesus changed your life? If everybody in your group, you don't know whether or not they're a Christian, then one question you could ask them is, when you come next week, tell us this. What is one way that you want Jesus to change your life? How do you want Jesus to change your life? So that's it for this week. Praying for you. Hope that your group time goes great. Here for you along the way. If you have questions, concerns, problems that come up, God bless you and your group.